We're moving now to Yanis Varoufakis, writer and former Greek finance minister. Yanis, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And so let's start with Howard Lutnick, who's the kind of man about cable lately, Commerce Secretary for President Donald Trump. Speaking yesterday, I believe this is on CNBC.
So, of course, it's going to be a top 10
that narrows
economy.
it.
What's that?
A top 10 economy from Asia?
Listen, the Asian markets are very complex, and there's a lot of talking to do, right? To get these things right, you've got to do a lot of talking. Now, we've only got 90 days, and we only got 60 left, so these things are coming, but you got to be patient. Now, we're going to get some deals done pretty soon. The president will decide when he announces it, because remember, I'm his commerce secretary, I do the work, but the boss, and you know the boss as well as anybody in the world.
I do.
And this is his deal to make,
But I'm told...
and his deal to do.
No, I appreciate that.
Yes, that was on Fox Business, but I wanted to play that clip because as we've been trying to report on the Trump administration's ongoing trade war, we've tried to give kind of the best possible perspective, put the Trump administration's argument in the best possible light so that people can agree with it or disagree with it. And I've had a really hard time figuring out what it is. Like, I don't exactly know what they're trying to accomplish. And some of your writing has been really helpful in laying out what possibly could be driving some of what the thinking is behind the Trump administration's kind of reorganizing of the world economy. What, at this point in time, what do you think the Trump administration is trying to accomplish?
Two basic things. The first thing they want to do is they want to substantially devalue the dollar, while simultaneously, and that may sound like a paradox, but I don't believe it is, maintaining the exorbitant privilege, the so-called exorbitant privilege of the dollar, maintaining its hegemonic presence in the world economy. That's one of the, possibly the most significant goal. The second thing they're trying to do is essentially tie together the extent to which the Trump administration is going to assault its allies and foes with Trump's tariffs, to tie this in to the extent to which tariffs are going to be used. So use tariffs in order to enhance the penetration of the American military-industrial complex in other people's economies, and to calibrate that penetration by means of the tariffs. But the first task, which I mentioned, seems to be, judging by what Scott Bessent is saying, what Stephen Miran are saying, it seems to me the number one priority.
It seems to be working, right? And what would be the consequence if they do successfully devalue the dollar but maintain the hegemonic presence?
And can I also say, Yanis, especially in the context of Trump pulling back originally because of what he saw in the bond market, I think he said people were getting, quote, a little yippy. How does all of this fit together?
Well, there's no doubt that he got a scare. He felt that the Liz Truss moment may be coming his way, undoubtedly. So he stepped back, but he's going to step forward again in his usual shuffle. But allow me to just by the way, lest I am misunderstood, I'm not supporting the Trumpian project. But I do believe that those of us who are politically opposed to it, we have a duty to understand it and not to dismiss them as a bunch of Neanderthals, which is what most of the liberal establishment, to their detriment, I have to add, are doing. So, look, if you heard Scott Bessent at the IMF the other day, he was really very clear. He talked about the Bretton Woods institutions. He talked about the Nixon shock in 1971. And essentially what he was telling his audience was, and it's not an irrational perspective to present to the world. What he was saying was, look, folks, ever since we became a deficit country, at the end of the 1960s, by 1970, America was a deficit country. We achieved something quite spectacular. We managed to grow our hegemonic power in proportion to our trade deficit and our budget deficit. That has never happened before. No empire has managed to grow its power while going into the red. And the United States managed to do it at the expense of the American working class, at the expense of a very substantial portion of the American middle class, but we did it. And then he adds, I don't believe we can carry on doing it, because there is a limit beyond which trade deficits are not sustainable anymore. And you see, the success of the Nixon administration, the Carter administration, the Reagan administration, and so on and so forth, was that they managed to make other people's capitalists pay for the American deficits in a manner which violently enriched the American rentier class. But that gave rise, in the end, to an incongruity. If you look at the dollar world, the world out there, the economic sphere that is denominated in dollars, it is gigantic, and it has been growing since the 1970s. But the manufacturing capacity, the real material economy of the United States, on which this dollar world is parasitic, has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So you have a huge parasite and a tiny little organism on which the big parasite is being parasitic to. Mm-hmm. So their concern is that this is becoming completely disproportional. They need to shrink the dollar world and increase the extent to which the American economy can manufacture stuff. This is what they want. So from their perspective, a devaluation of the dollar by around 30%, which is ballpark what they want, will restore something like an equilibrium, not an equilibrium, but it will take the whole gamut closer to an equilibrium. But they're very, very worried that this devaluation should not be allowed to diminish the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. And this is why they're playing hardball with China. This is why they're playing hardball with the Japanese. They're telling the Japanese, sell a chunk of your $1.2 trillion of savings, but don't buy Japanese yen, do not buy the euro, do not buy the Chinese yuan. We will tell you what to buy. So tariffs are, in that context, in the context of Besant, they are a sideshow. They may be very high up the list of priorities of the great Donald, but not his economic team. His economic team is far more interested in what they call the rebalancing of the dollar paper money trail and the actual productive capacities of the United States.
And let's put C1 on the screen. So this is from Arnaud Bertrand, who points out that China, Japan, South Korea, and the countries of ASEAN just issued a joint statement in which they take a unified stance against, quote, escalating trade protectionism, a clear reference to Trump's tariffs. And I want to ask Yanis, now that we've sort of established, I think very accurately, what the administration's goal is, and that's hazy in a lot of corners of the media where they have this distorted idea of what the administration is actually trying to do. Are they, how would you say that they're doing towards their own goal? If that is their own goal, how is the progress? Is it working, let's say, on their own terms?
Allow me to be frank. It is far too early to know. Imagine we had a time machine and we went back to, let's say, October 1971, a couple of months after the Nixon shock. It would have been impossible to predict whether the Nixon shock would have worked, because it took a decade for the Nixon shock to be implemented fully, which means that the Trump administration, this Trump administration, cannot.
Can you explain to us what the Nixon shock is?
In 1971, 15th of August, those old enough can remember that because it was a shocking day. It was the day when effectively Nixon blew up the international monetary system that the United States had painstakingly put together at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The golden age of American capitalism, of global capitalism, which was the 1950s and 60s, as we all know and remember. It was built on that monetary system. It was a remarkable system, come to think of it. It had, the anchor was the dollar. People say that it was the gold because indeed the United States guaranteed anyone with $35 an ounce of gold from Fort Knox. But that was a sideshow. It was more for show. The reality was that it was a monetary system predicated on the United States dollar, which was in fixed exchange rates, completely pegged to every other currency in Europe and in Japan, and the Japanese yen, for years, for decades. There were no fluctuations in exchange rates. Interest rates were stuck at around 4.5%, plus or minus 0.1, 0.2%. It was wonderfully boring, the whole financial establishment. Imagine, you never had to check the exchange rates or interest rates because for decades they were the same. And it was a golden era because what was the essence of the Bretton Woods system? It was that the United States exited the Second World War as the only creditor nation, as the only surplus nation, the only country with a large, gigantic trade surplus. It was the only country that was not in ashes after the Second World War. And the idea was to maintain those surpluses. The American administration would do whatever it took in order to dollarize Europe and Japan, essentially taking part of its surpluses, sending it to Europe and to Japan, either in the form of aid or loans, private loans, public loans, so that the Europeans and the Japanese would have enough dollars to purchase the American exports. And this worked brilliantly until the United States no longer had the surplus. And with typical bravado, Richard Nixon, it wasn't Nixon himself, there were some very interesting people around him. The Nixon team comprised Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor at the time, before he became the Secretary of State. It was John Connally, the former Texas governor, Democrat, who absconded and joined the Nixon administration and became the Treasury Secretary.
And he was shot next to Kennedy.
Yes, indeed. He was in the car when JFK was shot. And primarily, a young man called Paul Volcker, that no one knew at the time, who was the real brains of the Nixon shock. But the reason I'm mentioning that, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that, is the Nixon shock took place on the 15th of August 1971. It was major. Nixon sent Connally, his Treasury Secretary, to the Europeans, who were pulling their hair out because the dollar devalued so fast, and essentially inflation and unemployment was coming the way of the Europeans as a result of that move by Nixon. And Connally very arrogantly and aggressively looked at them with cynicism, I would say, and said to them, guys, the dollar is our currency, but from today, it is your problem. So when people say that, what Trump did is unprecedented, and never before has America treated its allies so badly, that's rubbish. They did it in 1971, and they kept doing it for years and years. And indeed, Paul Volcker, before he was appointed by Carter, chairman of the Fed, a couple of months before that, in 1978, if I remember correctly, he gave a speech at the University of Warwick in England, which was remarkable, because there he outlined the plan. And the plan was, and I am quoting here verbatim because it's etched in my mind, this speech of his. He said, the United States has opted, for reasons of its own national interest, for the controlled disintegration of the world economy. Does this remind you of anything? This is 1978, the controlled disintegration, and the Japanese and the Europeans were pulling their hair out. So, but you see, it took 10 years, because it wasn't just the Nixon shock in 1971, it was the Carter administration that continued that by appointing that same man, Paul Volcker, to be the head of the Fed. And then Reagan continued it, and then Bush continued it, and Clinton continued it. So whether, this is my excuse for saying it's too early to judge whether the Trump shock is going to work, because the question is there going to be this continuity in implementing the basic idea which people like Scott Bessent are outlining?
And so I often also fall into the trap of thinking that these are Neanderthals that are organizing this policy. But I agree and follow along with their analysis all the way up until basically implementation. When it comes to the implementation, it feels like there's no, and therefore this is how it's going to work out. And maybe I'm missing this as well, but they are, effectively, devaluing the dollar, creating conditions that could, create some manufacturing turnaround without having done the work of giving us the foundation on which we could build a manufacturing capacity. Like you still need things and people in order to feed that. Economics by itself is just magic. Like by magic, it can't just create things out of nothing. And if China tells us, well, we're not sending you any semiconductors, we're not sending you any of the magnets, you're not going to get any of the refined rare earths that your manufacturing capacity needs, we're going to have a collapse in our manufacturing base relative to last year. And then the politics are going to reverse and end this entire experiment before it even gets out of the lab. And that would then answer your question of whether it's working. Because in order for it to work, you need political continuity, and you can't have political continuity, I wouldn't think, if you get a significant recession and you don't see any green shoots of manufacturing out of it. So what am I missing there? Like, what does Bessent see as the potential for us to revitalize our manufacturing capacity while simultaneously cutting ourselves off from trade?
And Yanis, I'll just add, they're now saying the tax cut bill that Trump hopes to pass over the summer will include like 100% write-offs on building expenses,
okay,
equipment.
Well, that's something of an answer.
Retroactive to January 20th. So I don't know how you would react to all of that, yeah.
Well, I'll start with the last point you made about the tax cuts. We keep forgetting that Trump's shotgun has two barrels. One of them contained the tariffs, the second one, the tax cuts. The second has not been fired yet. And I think this is a very important part of their plan for attracting foreign capital, particularly German capital or Japanese capital or Taiwanese capital into the United States. But yes, look, you have every reason to be despondent about the lack of preparation, the chaotic nature of all these announcements, the very sloppy language that Donald Trump in particular uses. Reciprocal tariffs. There's no reciprocity in what he's doing. He's just going all out with gigantic tariffs in proportion to the trade deficit that the United States has vis-a-vis particular countries. So yes, I mean, it is a bit, you will excuse my unscientific term, it's a bit of a shit show. But then again, I have to take you back to 1971. It was exactly that in 1970. Richard Nixon was not the most coherent or reasonable people in the world, right? He was probably one of the worst ones. He also, on the 15th of August, what we tend to forget is that not only did he uncouple the United States dollar from gold and spearheaded a massive devaluation of the dollar, but he also did something else. He introduced tariffs, 10% tariffs, immediately, the same day. And then he took those back 3 months later. So that's why I keep insisting that we've seen this play before. And we have seen the chaos, and we have seen how remarkably it worked, not on behalf of the working class of the United States, of the middle class of the United States. They were destroyed. I mean, as you know, in your country, hourly real wages are still below the level that they used to be at in 1973. When Trump talks about the carnage in the heartlands of the United States, he's completely right. Of course, he uses this to exploit the people who vote for him and trust him. And I think they trust him in a manner which they will live to regret one at some point. But we've seen all this before. Now, let's get to the point. Is this going to work or not? Well, I don't think it's going to work. I think that it's not going to work from the perspective of the MAGA base who put their trust in Trump to bring back a sufficient number of jobs and a quality of jobs that would somehow restore their capacity to dream the American dream. And the reason is not that capital is not going to rush to the United States. I have no doubt that it is already rushing into the United States. I have spoken to people in Germany. I've spoken to people in France. I've spoken to people in Japan. And they are increasing very substantially the amount of investment they are going to be putting into the United States. That is not the problem. Capital is flowing already in the United States. But I don't think the number of jobs is going to be proportional to the amount of capital, because if you think about, take Apple, for instance. When Apple introduced manufacturing again in the United States some years ago, they built that factory that makes their laptops, the MacBook Pros, in somewhere near Austin, Texas. Well, the number of jobs was minuscule because of automation. So a lot of the new manufacturing capacity is going to create a jobless surge. So this is problem number one. But allow me to tell you what I think is the real danger that Trump should be thinking about, especially during the night, keeping him awake. If I were him, I would worry about success. Because if he is successful in bringing back manufacturing to the United States to the extent that he says that he will, which I don't think he will, but let's say that he does, then what happens? Then the trade deficit of the United States shrinks. But the trade deficit of the United States is the flip side of the massive rents extracted from the global economy by American rentiers. Because come to think of it, it is the American trade deficit which keeps German factories churning, Japanese factories, and Chinese factories. And it is the dollars that these capitalists in Germany, Japan, and in China collect, which they accumulate, and then they bring it back to, or send it to New York, to Wall Street, to be recycled in the form of US government debt, treasuries, some equities, and a lot of real estate. So the reason why financial markets have been doing so well over the last 40 years or so, the reason why realtors like Trump have been amassing these gigantic rents for the last 40 years is the American trade deficit. So what happens when he eliminates it, if he succeeds in eliminating it? Well, he's going to have some really very cross rentiers, financiers, and realtors. His tribe are going to be livid with him. Can he sustain that, or will he choose to betray the working class that voted for him? I suspect it will be the latter.
And so, so what would that look like? So let's say the rentier class is now getting pinched. And it's an incredible irony that it is a kingpin of the rentier class that, he's literally a real estate developer that is leading this operation that then pinches people like him. What then happens if you no longer have these dollars, flowing out to German factories, Chinese factories, Japanese factories, and then recycled back into Wall Street and then circulated throughout the U.S. rentier class? Like, what does happen? Like, what do the factories do? What do the rentiers do?
Well, you see, I don't think we will reach the point where the rentiers' interests will be so seriously jeopardized. That is, even if the Trumpian playbook is implemented and starts working, and the trade deficit starts shrinking, at some point, the administration itself will stop it from shrinking. They will say, okay, well, we have reduced it by, I don't know what percentage. We have recalibrated, rebalanced the dollar world and the manufacturing world, the US manufacturing world, to some extent, and that's enough. And now we are going to do other things. Like, for instance, we are going to give even more tax cuts. We are going to allow Elon Musk to go crazy with his, Tesla autonomously driven vehicles, deregulate completely, put all our eggs in the big tech basket, which is where the United States still has a significant advantage vis-a-vis the rest of the world and to some extent China. And accumulate rents in that regard. But that will create political chaos because the MAGA base will have been betrayed firstly by Obama in 2008, then by Biden, and now by Trump 2.0. And therefore, nothing good is going to transpire when it comes to the quality of what we call our democratic process here in the West.
Yanis Varoufakis, thank you so much for joining us. This was fascinating and very helpful. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.